Hi, everyone. Welcome. Again, just absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Katie, for being here. I am not going to be able to tell you all about Katie and her work because I could just expound forever. Katie is absolutely brilliant. I'm thrilled we get to hear a little bit about some of her projects today. First, I want to thank the Luskin Center for Innovation, the LCI staff for making this event possible and pulling it together at pretty short notice and creating amazing flyers and events page and everything that got all of you here, the delicious food. Thanks, Colleen Callahan, Connie Seymour, and Megan Mullen. I will just read a short bio of Katie's, and then I think you're all here to hear from her, so I will turn it over to her. Dr. Kathryn McConnell is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. Her research examines the intersection of environmental hazards, the built environment, and population mobility, with a focus on understanding the long-term impacts of highly destructive wildfires. Kathryn previously worked as a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University's Population Studies and Training Center, and she holds a PhD from Yale School of the Environment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McConnell.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you and hopefully hear some of your feedback and take your questions. Much appreciated. Thank you also to the Luskin Center for hosting, to Meg and Colleen for pulling this together. Really appreciate it. My name is Kathryn or Katie McConnell. I'm joining you from Vancouver, Columbia. I'm coming from a sociology department, and much of my research is trying to understand the long-term sort of social impacts of disasters, and in particular, wildfires. Like so many others, I've been watching from afar the fires that have happened here, hearing from colleagues here in LA about what's happening on the ground. So I imagine and know that there are some of you in the audience who are involved, personally affected in certain ways, and also potentially involved in research and recovery efforts afterwards. So given this context, I designed this talk to touch on different pieces of research more broadly in hopes that that might give you sort of more useful starting points to the extent that this work has use for you all. To give you a little bit of background about myself, I grew up in Boise, Idaho, which for those of you who might not have been there, like California, Idaho is a very fire-prone place. So I grew up in the setting where fires were normal. It was a normal part of life. I grew up with friends and parents of friends who were.
Sorry,
You're
we're
good.
hearing that your chin is the only part of you.
Thank you. Is that better?
We'll find out.
Okay.
We have a mole.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. Glad to pause whenever. So I grew up in this very fire-prone landscape. I also grew up amidst a lot of firefighters for whom firefighting was an occupation. So this was something that was always just a part of life for me. I then moved to the East Coast for college and graduate school. I think one of the really formative research experiences that I had before doing my PhD was work that I did at the City University of New York. I was attached to an environmental health research unit, and I was a research coordinator for really long-term study of folks who had been first responders at the World Trade Center right after 9/11. So I spent a lot of time sitting face to face with folks who, many of whom were police officers, many of whom had been there on the ground doing recovery efforts. And this work was also being conducted 15 years plus after the event. It was trying to understand how that experience that had happened over a decade ago shaped folks' experiences of ongoing post-traumatic stress as well as asthma. So just to contextualize, for me, this experience, I think, helped me understand how long these types of disasters can affect the people who end up not just being displaced by them, but actually working on these sites. So much of the things that I think about in the context of fires are really what happens in the many years after the event. So today I'll start by giving you a bit of introduction to the 2018 Camp Fire, which is what much of the work that I'll be presenting is focused on. I have two different migration-related projects focused on the aftermath of the Camp Fire. Then I'll shift into talking about patterns of housing loss and housing reconstruction after the Camp Fire. And then to conclude, I want to touch a bit on the work that Meg described, this work that we've been thinking about to what extent does managed retreat work or not work in the context of fire? So many of you may remember the 2018 Camp Fire, but I want to sort of recall some context for this event. So this fire happened in Northern California in Butte County. It burned up in this more sort of forested mountain region and then came down the foothills that lead into Chico. While most people remember this as the fire that burned the town of Paradise, it also had major impacts on surrounding much smaller unincorporated communities of Magalia, Concow, and Butte Creek Canyon. In this presentation, I'll collectively refer to the communities that were affected by the Camp Fire as the Ridge, which is how this place was sort of colloquially referred to on the ground. Before the fire, the Ridge had around 56,000 people living there. Relative to the rest of California, just to give you a very brief demographic snapshot, communities on the Ridge were less affluent, so had lower incomes. They tended to be older. This is a predominantly white community, much more so than the rest of California. This is also an area where, though it was lower income, it was also a place where lower and middle income folks could still afford to buy a home, which was reflected in actually on average higher rates of homeownership in this area. A final note about housing is that around 20% of residents prior to the fire lived in mobile homes, which was a really important form of affordable housing. So in interviews that I conducted with residents who lived on the Ridge, I found that residents often wanted to share with me what the place was like before the fire. And so they would often show me photos of their homes, or they would invite me to explore what the community had looked like through Google Maps, which allows you to sort of look back in time at what the place was like. So here you're seeing images of how these different communities looked like before they were burned. Given the saturation of destruction photos that I'm sure you all are very familiar with now, I do like to take time to share with you what the place was like and give you a sense of how and why people were so connected to the landscape that they lived on. I think the final piece of context I want to share with you about the Camp Fire is to contextualize this fire in the context of other high structural loss events. Between 1999 and 2020, the Camp Fire was by far the most destructive fire, just in terms of number of buildings destroyed. Around 19,000 structures were lost, 14,000 of which were residential, which reflects around an 80% structural loss rate within the burn footprint. So really, really high loss rate. This figure that you're looking at is showing you the distribution of the top 10% of fires, sort of all documented fires in the US over these 2 decades that had the highest levels of structural loss. So even just in this top fraction of destructive events, you see this really long right tail where we have a small number of extremely high loss events, with the Camp Fire being here as by far the most extreme. The data that I used to produce this figure have not been updated in recent years, but my understanding and my best guess is that the LA fires fall probably somewhere out on the scale as well. So I want to start by sharing findings from 2 different projects that are focused on understanding post-fire migration dynamics. Sometimes when I share work on migration, I think people who have not worked in this space think that there is an official government-led effort to track displacement after major disasters, to understand where displaced people move to and what their needs are. And so for context, to the very best of my knowledge, no such government agency is actually out there systematically doing this work. Instead, the main information we have on post-disaster migration and post-fire migration specifically comes from different teams of researchers working in this space, but who are also themselves working with really imperfect data that are often not actually well suited to answering the questions we may want to ask. For a little bit more context within the broader world of environmental migration or climate migration literature, fires are really understudied hazard relative to other events like flooding or hurricanes. So this is an area, fires and migration, that we actually have pretty limited information on. Though I would flag that one of the scholars who has been doing work in this space, doing really important work, is with us today. Nick Tinoco is a PhD candidate based here in UCLA's sociology program and has been making really important contributions. So the first work I'll share is a quantitative assessment of wildfire impacts on migration, looking at this top roughly 500 highest structure loss fires that occurred between 99 and 2020. Then the second piece of work I'm going to share is in progress qualitative research based on interviews that I conducted with Ridge residents whose homes were destroyed in the fire and who permanently relocated away from the county and who are not trying to move back. For some additional context, many Ridge residents ended up actually moving to Idaho, which is again where I grew up and where I was living while I was conducting this work. So part of my work involved some sort of place-based field work with folks who relocated to Idaho. If you're not familiar, this is the shape of Idaho. So working with a broader team of demographers, we had an economist and several fire scientists. We recently published this analysis of wildfire impacts on migration trends in Nature Communications. And again, this quantitative results, this is based on aggregation of 519 really highly destructive fires that show us more generalized trends of post-wildfire migration across events. To give you a brief snapshot of the methods, we used administrative records on wildfires that are reported to the government in daily incident command reports. This gives us information on fire severity, how many structures were lost by each event, paired then with wildfire burn footprints, which give us spatial details about where the fire actually occurred. And then finally, we pair these data with Equifax, the credit bureau. They have a consumer credit panel, which is a sample of their credit visible residents in the US, from which we can observe moves from address to address, or in our case, from tract to tract and between quarters. So for this analysis, we stratified our events by structure loss. So we're essentially examining the effects of different sets of wildfires at different levels of severity. And sort of the big picture takeaway findings are that in this top decile of destructive fires, those less destructive events, so those that destroyed 250 buildings or less, really had no observable effect on in or out migration. But when you shift into this more destructive set of fires, so those are destroy around 250 to closer to 7,000 structures, these have a moderate effect on out migration. So as you would expect, people are leaving these places. Finally, we pull out the campfire because it's such an extreme outlying event, higher loss rates than any other event within the data set, to analyze the campfire separately. And you can see that here, this fire has actually the largest effect on out migration, which is what you're observing here in this top red line is showing you, this is when the fire happened, these are migration trends, so out migration probability, in migration probability before the fire. The event happens and you see this big spike, but then it sort of migration remains elevated for some quarters after the event. So our takeaways from these findings are that even among fires that destroy buildings, generally speaking, for most fires, we actually don't see a large migration response. When structure loss is very high, however, we do see heightened out migration, which we interpret to be related most likely to displacement due to housing loss. So these more direct effects when people literally can't remain in place because their housing is no longer available. We also interpret the lack of migration effects at lower levels of structure loss as a lack of what we would call more indirect effects of the fire. So you can imagine there may be other reasons why people would move away after a fire that are different from their house being destroyed. Potentially folks are anticipating future fires or other parts of the landscape have been affected that influence their desire to keep living there. We would think of these as more indirect effects of the fire, but we don't think our data really give a strong case that these types of indirect effects are happening, at least for the time period that we examined. With this context in mind, I now want to shift to qualitative interview-based work that I focused on specifically understanding migration decision-making after the campfire. This work is still in process, and for this presentation, I've pulled out a smaller subset of around 27 interviews that I conducted with individuals and couples who lost their home in the fire, who had permanently relocated outside of the ridge and were spread across these states shown here in blue. And here I was trying to understand for folks who had lost their home, how they made decisions where to live and whether they wanted to return and rebuild or not. I conducted these interviews, I would say, starting around the year after the fire, very much punctuated and changed by COVID happening at the same time. So many of these interviews ended up being conducted more like 2 to 2.5 years after the fire. One of the methodological challenges of qualitative post-disaster research is how to find residents who relocate really quickly. And my sense is that place-based qualitative disaster research that happens where the event occurred, while really important, also won't fully capture the experiences of the many people who relocate and end up living in different cities, sometimes different states. Also really hard to capture folks who move frequently after the event, which is also a common experience. So I ended up connecting with those I interviewed through this project through snowball sampling and conducted interviews mostly remotely, which allowed me, I think, to gain this wider geographic reach. Of course, a major limitation to this methodological approach is that those interviewed are very likely not representative of all movers. But I do think these interviews are still valuable in helping us understand some of the push and pull factors that were at play as residents were making decisions of whether to return to the ridge or whether to permanently relocate. Before getting into some of the findings, I want to briefly highlight what I think is a really fantastic initiative that was put up by Chico State, which is the closest nearby large university to where the Camp Fire happened. This effort was led by a really amazing small team, including a Chico State sociologist named Marianne Paiva, along with a librarian and a local public radio reporter. They developed the Camp Fire Oral History Project, which is a public repository of interviews conducted with residents who were impacted by the fire in different ways. So I connected with the folks running this oral history project as I started my work and ended up including an option for many of the interviews I conducted to be contributed to this larger oral history project, which many folks that I spoke with opted for. So I just want to highlight, I think this is a fantastic model and has created an invaluable archive, both for the community and also for researchers. So now I'll shift into some of those sort of big picture findings on how people made decisions to move away. And in particular, here I'll emphasize reasons why people were actually not seeking to return to the ridge and rebuild. I expect this will feel really familiar to those of you following the fires here, but out of all the interviews I conducted, housing access was by far the most dominant factor in households' decision to leave the ridge. What some working in migration studies would call a push factor, reason why people left. For many, this lack of affordable housing acted as a barrier to remaining nearby and actually spending the years it can take to do the work of rebuilding. Some people I spoke with wanted to remain in Butte County, but simply weren't able to because they couldn't find housing. Housing became very scarce after the event. It also became very expensive. So for example, Grace and her husband, Henry, a white couple in their 50s, initially stayed in Butte County. They were living between an RV park and couch surfing with friends for around 6 months as they tried to find a place to live. Eventually, after not being able to find a stable living situation, they started looking farther away, across the border over into Nevada. Grace recounts, we couldn't find anything in Butte County because prices went up astronomically after the fire. We couldn't find a rental. We couldn't find anything that was in our budget to purchase. So we expanded our search over to where our friends were in Nevada. But then even after crossing into a different state, Grace and Henry were still not able to find housing. They were outbid on more than 5 different offers they put to purchase a home, which eventually led them to relocate to Idaho, which is where they were living by the time I met them. So again, based on the reporting I've been reading in LA, I imagine this sounds familiar. But for some residents, along with this push factor of constrained local affordable housing was also the pull factor of relatively more affordable housing outside of California. So for some, the fire actually opened up access to financial resources such as federal disaster programs, home insurance payouts, and eventually payments from litigation with Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which they then decided to take elsewhere into more affordable housing markets. So as an example, Lisa and Frank, a couple in their 60s who had been renters for much of their lives, After the fire, they learned about a federal program, I believe it was run through HUD, that was offering home loans to wildfires specifically. And these loans, part of the way they were structured was that they could be used anywhere in the US. They were not specifically tied to California. So Frank and Lisa had already been considering moving to Idaho when they retired. They were sort of on the verge of retirement. And with this loan and with Idaho's housing market being relatively cheaper than California's, they were then able to purchase a newly constructed house in the greater Boise metro region. Frank describes, we went from renters to homeowners. We get to buy our house. Lisa adds, it was a very good deal. Our house payment is less than we were paying for rent in Paradise. And Frank notes, we're paying less than we were before. We're buying our own house instead of buying someone else's house, and it's brand new. We're the first ones in it. So I see for Frank and Lisa, this fire was a precipitating event that hastened their ability to move into retirement and to move actually into homeownership. It's a bit counterintuitive in some ways. I think so much of post-disaster research very rightly focuses on understanding barriers to return and how to remove obstacles for people who've been displaced and eventually do want to come back. This work is really important, and I especially want to highlight the research that my colleagues Nicole Lambro and Crystal Colden, who I believe was here several weeks ago, have been doing in this area. From the work that I've been doing that was really trying to understand the experience of residents who'd moved away from the affected areas, I actually ended up hearing a lot about why people did not want to return and rebuild on the ridge. So I wanted to pull out some of these reasons because I think they might be a bit less intuitive for folks who have not gone through this experience themselves. So first, a number of residents, especially I would say older residents, shared that they didn't feel they had the time remaining in their own lifespans to go through what they perceived to be a really long recovery process. So Lauren, a woman who was in her 50s, shared, at first I was really bent on rebuilding my home, but then when I really saw it and I pictured what it would be like to live in that, she goes on to say, I'd heard so many things on the news. They said it would be 5 years before the water system's running again. It would be 10, maybe 20 before businesses could support themselves or be supported by the community. And it would be 20 or 30 years before there's no evidence of the fire as you drive through town. If I were 30, I would have stayed, but I'm not. I'm in my 50s. So for many I spoke with, much of the importance of the ridge as home rested not just in the physical place, but in the people in the community that were based there. And after such a large displacement event, some residents perceived that not enough other residents would return to be able to meaningfully rebuild those social networks, which then in turn did not incline them to want to return. Different elements also of the physical landscape shaped residents' decisions not to return. So after the fire, the physical environment of the ridge changed enormously. What had once been this largely forested mountain town saw many trees burned and subsequently hauled out, removed, which really just changed the feeling of being there. A number of residents I spoke with described how this loss of sense of place really removed for them what would have been a core reason to return. Further, many residents described having ongoing traumas related to escaping from the fire or having lost friends, family members, and neighborhoods, that then these traumas were worsened by actually being in the place where the event had happened. So for these residents also, it was hard to imagine wanting to rebuild and live in that place. These traumas in turn were tied to concerns about future fire risk, in which residents were not only making calculations about whether a similar event could happen in the future, but they also described having really strong emotional responses to things like smelling smoke or being evacuated, and didn't want to live with those ongoing sort of consistent reminders of the fire. Finally, speaking to the sort of some of these landscape drivers after the fire, there were issues with water and soil toxicity. So even after some years of substantial cleanup, local jurisdictions had declared water systems safe. Concerns about toxicity among residents who'd moved away really persisted. Finally, especially among residents I spoke with who moved specifically to Idaho, partisan politics actually played a role in their decision to relocate and also in shaping their decisions of where they would move. I interviewed a number of politically conservative residents who felt frustrated by California's Democrat-dominated politics, and really wanted to relocate somewhere where they felt that their political views were better represented by state lawmakers and by their neighbors. So I think for me, reflecting on what relevance these findings from really different fire might have for thinking about the LA fires, I think what I would offer is that my expectation is different residents who've been displaced will likely have really different visions for how they want to move forward and what future they want. For some, I'm sure this will involve rebuilding and returning to their neighborhoods. For others, perhaps especially of those who have already left the greater LA region, they may not want to return. And this permanent relocation to different states and different places also suggests, I think, different types of need for post-disaster support that also might not be based here in LA, but in fact would need to be based in other places where people have relocated to. So I'll now shift to sharing some work thinking more specifically about changes in the built environment focused on understanding post-fire housing loss and housing reconstruction. And here I'm sharing results from a recent publication co-authored with my colleague Christian Brannian, who is a remote sensing scientist based at NASA's Goddard Institute in New York. In this work, we were really interested to understand what sociologists would refer to as neighborhood change that happened after the fire, and especially interested to investigate whether social stratification of the built environments that people lived in before the fire were then implicated in generating uneven disaster impacts in terms of which buildings were destroyed and which survived. We were then subsequently interested in tracking how housing recovery was playing out after the fire. So this project also is very much focused on the campfire. So I imagine you're very familiar with maps like these, which document structure by structure, whether a building within a burn footprint was destroyed, damaged, or survived. And here I'm showing just a small snapshot of such data that were produced by CAL FIRE based on in-person field visits after the campfire, and then which we subsequently used for our analysis. I think when many people see these maps, sometimes the patterns of structure loss and which structures were destroyed with this sort of seemingly random assortment of which structures had no damage or low damage sort of spread throughout can seem really random. But there's actually been really important biophysical research conducted with data like these that aim to understand how different physical factors, things like slope, defensible space, surrounding vegetation, are all associated with likelihoods of structure loss. So Christian and I were interested to build on this area of research, but with the broader aim of understanding how building loss patterns may fall across socioeconomic axes. So to do so, we examined differences in structure loss rates by building type, first paying special attention to differences in loss rates between single-family homes, multifamily homes, and then mobile homes or RVs. We also examined the relationship between loss probability and building value. And then finally, we examined loss probability by housing tenure, breaking out whether a building was owner or renter occupied. We found strong evidence that building destruction really wasn't random, but was uneven across these three social characteristics of buildings that we examined. So first, compared to all other building types, we found mobile homes and RVs were more likely to have been destroyed in the fire. Additionally, as the building's value decreased, the probability that the building was destroyed increased. So in other words, more expensive buildings and homes were more likely to have survived the fire. And then third, compared to owner-occupied homes, renter-occupied homes were also more likely to have been destroyed. After introducing a suite of different biophysical covariates into our models to try to get some traction to understand why we were seeing these patterns physically, we found that building density explained a lot of the heightened sensitivity of these buildings, these specific building types to fire, in which structures that were in close proximity to other structures were generally lower in value and were also then more likely to be destroyed. To us, these findings suggest that the ways social inequalities were already expressed in the built environment before the fire, then in turn very much influenced the ways that the fire's physical impacts ended up being distributed. I want to take a minute to reflect on some of the implications of these findings for wildfire mitigation planning. This strong association between high building density and high likelihood of structure loss, I think, tells us a lot about heightened vulnerability for dense neighborhoods. So you can see in this image on the left, these are the same data that I showed earlier, but these clusters of points circled in blue are showing you 3 different mobile home parks on the ridge. These buildings in the parks are sited very close to each other, and the dark red is indicating that these structures were completely destroyed. So you can sort of start to see this pattern here that if one home in the park ignited, there were really high odds that most, if not all, other homes in the park would also ignite and be destroyed. In this figure then on the right, you're looking at an example of defensible space guidelines, which in this example, you can see are imagined for a single family home on a large lot. But when we looked at the spatial layout of homes in dense neighborhoods on the ridge and mobile home parks in particular, we actually did the calculations of distance between homes. And we found that it was physically impossible for many individual mobile homes to have the recommended amount of defensible space, given the close proximity to other homes, if we're considering homes themselves as fuel sources, which we know they're starting to serve as in these house-to-house burns. So to us, these findings suggest that we need to think more deeply about what wildfire mitigation strategies look like for dense neighborhoods and especially for mobile home parks. After analyzing destruction patterns, we then turned to try to understand which buildings were being reconstructed after the fire. We looked 20 months out from the fire. This timeframe was based more on data availability constraints than the ideal timeframe that we would have liked to have looked at. But we wanted to understand whether early reconstruction trends were following a pattern of post-fire gentrification. So to do this, we ended up developing a geospatial remote sensing based machine learning approach that can sort of semi-automatically detect buildings within high resolution aerial imagery. So I'll very briefly walk you through this procedure. We first trained a machine learning algorithm on pre-fire imagery, which is shown at the top here. This is just like a little snapshot. We used a database of vector building footprints created by Microsoft to essentially teach the algorithm to identify which pixels in an image are buildings and which are not buildings. So in step 2, after training the algorithm on pre-fire imagery, we then applied it to post-fire imagery, which gives us a classified binary grid of buildings or not buildings, which is shown in black and white in step 3. And then finally, by overlaying points of where buildings have been destroyed on the grid, we can identify which have been reconstructed, so those points you're looking at in blue, and which have not, so those points you're looking at shown in pink. Through this process, we identified which types of buildings were more likely to have been rebuilt. And here we did find evidence of emerging post-fire gentrification and that higher value homes and owner-occupied homes were more likely to have been reconstructed in this 20-month timeframe after the fire. The timeframe we examined, again, was relatively short, but I would highlight that subsequent work by our colleague Nicole Imbro and colleagues conducted 5 years after the fire has found broadly similar trends of gentrification. So as I've presented this research over the years on wildfire impacts, I noticed that I was getting more and more questions from audiences about this idea of managed retreat. At the same time, I was seeing a growing number of assertions in op-eds, policy reports, sometimes academic writing, that managed retreat from fire-prone places was something that should happen. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, really broadly, managed retreat refers to the relocation of structures away from environmentally hazardous places, especially those places that we expect will become more hazardous due to climate change. After structures are removed, land is then left unbuilt. As you can see in this image where a rectangle is located, this is showing you a site of managed retreat on a coast where houses that had been very close to the coastline had been removed, leaving open land in their place. This idea of managed retreat emerged very much from a coastal engineering, coastal management practice as a response to sea level rise. Retreat has been primarily operationalized in the US in 2 ways in the flood context. First, through individual property acquisitions made by governments, also sometimes referred to as property buyouts. We've also seen retreat look like fully planned community relocations in which a community collectively relocates to a new place together. So as I was fielding these questions about managed retreat for fire, I connected with your colleague, Liz Koslov, based here at UCLA, in part in the Luskin School. And Liz's work is very much based on understanding a community-initiated retreat efforts after Hurricane Sandy in New York City. So again, very sort of coastal water-based context. So Liz, coming from sort of coastal retreat standpoint, and myself thinking about fires, started thinking, researching, and writing about this idea of managed retreat from fire, which right now is a really speculative idea. It's not widely practiced as a response to fire. With support from the National Science Foundation, as well as co-hosted by the Luskin Center, both Meg Mullen and Nick Tinoco were also involved in this effort. We hosted a workshop here at UCLA, actually in this very same room last fall, bringing together academics, but also wildfire and flood practitioners and community members who live in fire and flood affected places. Sophie also was there. We have so many workshop attendees here. It's fantastic. So we brought these folks together to really think deeply and critically about what managed retreat from wildfire might look like, and also the potentially very large limitations of applying this flood adaptation toolkit to a wildfire context. Right now, we're working on writing a proceedings report that will capture some of the discussions that happened at the workshop, and that we hope to have coming out sometime this summer. But as sort of concluding few thoughts, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways that I think may have some relevance to conversations that are starting to happen here in LA. First, when thinking about property buyout initiatives, we know that these programs rely largely on voluntary homeowner participation. This means that given a neighborhood for which property buyouts are made available, in many cases, some residents may opt to take a buyout, while others will not. So then from subsequent research on flood-based buyout initiatives, we've seen that this has resulted in this spatial checkerboarding of landscapes in which some homes are bought out and have the home removed. An example you can see here, while other homes just continue to remain in the neighborhood and people keep living there. This spatial patchwork pattern poses really specific challenges for the prospect of buyouts in the context of wildfire. And the reason is that wildfire risk is so closely tied to vegetation. And we know that absent management, vegetation will regrow in empty lots, which can in turn heighten fire risk, especially if we imagine that there may still be residents remaining nearby lots that had been bought out. So just because we don't have good examples of buyouts in the context of fire, we look to other cases of land use change and land abandonment to get a sense of what this might look like. This is an example from my fieldwork in Paradise, showing you vegetation regrowth in a building lot in Paradise that was taken, I think, not even 3 or 4 years after the fire. And just for context, it's a bit hard to see scale, but like this brush is taller than me. So really fast, really high volumes of vegetation regrowth. Some of you may have also been following what happened in the fire in Lahaina in Hawaii, which I understand spread very quickly, in part through overgrown former sugarcane plantations that were neighboring developed areas where people lived. We've also seen similar dynamics play out in Europe, where we had these sort of formerly agricultural lands that had been largely abandoned during periods of urbanization in the late 20th century, have now resulted in really large vegetation growth and fuel loads that now are identified as the source of higher fire risk. All of this to say, this buyout model that we've generally seen, as we've seen it practiced in the flood context, we think could potentially increase fire risk if applied in this sort of patchwork way. I think a further implication to thinking about what land actually looks like post-retreat is that any retreat project in the context of fire would require ongoing management to address this vegetation regrowth issue, which is a really different cost proposition than flood-based retreat, in which oftentimes we see post-retreat land not actively managed after a buyout. So for these reasons, we would say that the buyout approach likely can't be so readily applied from a flood to a fire context, and I think would need a lot more consideration before being widely initiated. Liz and I and others at the workshop, I would say, are especially interested, though, in following some of the ways that retreat might be done collectively, and especially in emerging initiatives to pool land holdings and then use them to create sort of publicly managed natural buffers around residential areas. So the image shown here is the Town of Paradise Parks Department's plan to do just this, where these different colors you're looking at are proposed different buffer areas surrounding residential cores that would be created from the strategic purchasing of residential lots where homes had been destroyed, which would then be strategically purchased by the town. These buffer areas would then be designed and managed as part of Paradise's larger park system, so having actually this co-benefit of creating open space. While not explicitly part of the Paradise project, these collective buffer initiatives could also have the potential to be used as shelter-in-place sites, which I think is a newer, emerging, and really important area of future research. In this way, the prospect of wildfire retreat, we're interested in how it may actually open up new configurations of collective land ownership and management that might look really different than property by property buyouts. So as I mentioned, Liz and I and others are working to develop this public proceedings report that will capture these ideas as well as much greater depth in points of agreement, but also disagreement among the folks who joined us for the workshop this past fall. But in the meantime, I think the biggest picture takeaways I hope you take from this conversation on retreat are that, one, managed retreat is not a widely practiced response to wildfire in the US. To the best of our knowledge, we actually have not seen communities seeking to collectively relocate away from high fire risk places, nor have we really seen much or any use of buyouts in fire prone areas. Based on what we know about how wildfire risk operates and how flood-based retreat programs have functioned in the past, I think there are potentially some really major limitations in applying these flood-based tools to wildfire setting. This is not to say it couldn't happen, but we would really caution against assuming that removing both people and homes from landscapes would necessarily or effectively reduce fire risk. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Many thanks to funders, and really looking forward to talking about this with you all. Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, have there been any studies done about, well, a couple of things. One, the effect on when you do an appraisal of the land, whether the effect of the appraisal of the remaining houses after fire, that's number one. The second one is just the general effect on land values in fire areas.
Oh, this is such a good question. I believe there's
The real estate appraisal.
Yeah. I believe there's a team of economists at the University of Anchorage who've been working on this, and I've seen a couple things start to be published in the past few years.
When you have 1 or 2 houses left and the rest are gone, then their houses are worth zero because no one would want to live there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. This is a really important and understudied area. I hope there are folks working on that question, and I think I agree with you. Really important.
When you have the checkerboarding with like an open lot, that affects the value of
absolutely.
On that block.
Yeah. I mean, I should ask, there are folks here who study retreat more deeply than I am. Are you aware of any like checkerboarding property value type work?
I
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that is okay. This is a really good question, and I think there is some work. I'm thinking even of projects Mugi, has been involved with, and Meg Mullen probably knows this more. But in the case I studied in Hurricane Sandy, there were debates about it could go kind of either way. Depends what happens to that land. There were people who thought, well, if my neighbor leaves, and then I've got like this natural space around your house all of a sudden, and that could maybe increase. I think there's been some work that's shown that in some cases it can increase property values, in some cases it can decrease property values. It sort of depends a lot on that.
But if I'm a prospective homeowner on that particular tract of land or that particular community, I would probably ask questions about the history of the neighborhood, and I would find out that there was 1 or more fires, and then that would and then maybe I would want to talk to an appraiser about it, not necessarily get an actual appraisal, but it would affect my thinking in terms of whether I would move there.
Yeah, totally hear you. Would love to talk about this with you afterwards. I think it's a really interesting question. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of build on a question.
Yeah.
It probably means that the same answer is
Yeah.
going to be similar. There's this I noticed one of the checkerboard options, one of those homes looked like a lower value home. And that was the one that was gone. So to your kind of equity assumptions, that was interesting.
Yeah.
And probably has something to do with it, but I also wondered if anyone's looked at, programs, there are buyout programs that aren't related to loss, that are in the private market. They're related to choice, and conservation easement, so for the
okay.
land trust alliance
Yeah.
and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The advantage of that approach, which is why I'm wondering if it's been looked at in disaster context, is that in higher net value places, you can combine true loss value as determined by a private appraiser as opposed to a public appraiser. If anyone's worked with appraisals on buyouts, like the private appraisal supported by the IRS for tax deduction, but it's way higher than what you can get
Interesting.
out of because the public appraisal process is much more constrained.
Interesting.
And so it's really hard to compete.
Yeah.
But if you could, before you get into the public money, set the deal up, and I'm thinking of like high net worth areas now, like we have like Palisades Coast.
Yeah.
You could actually create a post-tax advantage deal for everybody different, right? Depending on their estate plan, their income over the next 10 years, since it like takes 10 years to make it against income, there's all these factors. So I guess the question there is, has anyone looked at combining donation value
Oh, man.
with purchase through a conservancy approach?
Interesting.
Public money
Yeah.
approach?
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. I'm not pulling up anything that I've read that's about this approach, but I would also love to talk with you after and put you in touch with, again, I know there are folks who've been doing retreat work much longer. That might have a good answer. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thinking about cases in LA that are subject to both flood and sea level rise risk and fire, like houses in Malibu and PCH that burned.
Yeah.
Have you thought about or done any planning or seen any policies that are kind of like, okay,
Addressing
well,
both?
we're
Yeah.
already having to mitigate for sea level rise now that your house is
Yeah.
burned down, like you can't rebuild,
Yeah.
or like there's going to be
Yeah.
different regulations,
Yeah.
those kind of things.
I have not seen that. I don't know if anyone else has examples to share. Is this in response to the, okay. I have not seen those examples. I think it's something that Liz and I have been thinking a lot about, sort of potential compound hazarding of fires followed by landslides. We know sometimes landslides also can trigger buyouts, which we have someone studying here as well. It's a really good question. It's also, I'm not thinking of folks who've studied that. I think it's interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I don't have a better answer. Yes, yes. Hi.
So this relates to some of those questions as well, but one of the things that my husband, whose former home burned down in Palisades, is that the financial condition of insurance would have an enormous effect on whether people would rebuild.
Yeah.
And also the type of condition that the house is in prior to the burn, because your house is in certain condition to be insured. And how well insured the house is, and that would also be indicated by the financial well-worthiness of the owner, right? So I think it might be interesting to incorporate that into your research, because that more than almost any other factor is going to dictate rebuild.
Yeah.
If you're not well insured, you're not rebuilding.
Yeah.
And a lot of those multifamily homeowners, if they had rent controlled tenants, they probably didn't care for the building very well, and they probably weren't willing.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of drivers here in the just the private markets that really dictate what's going on, and I think that should be part of your presentation. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is a very different point, is that I am part of an urban canopy sort of activist group, and one of the things that's really remarkable about Palisades is that the trees did not burn.
Yeah.
They did not generate burn. It was really house to house. It was the feel of the houses.
Yeah.
And so I would appreciate it if you would look really closely at your imagery, especially on slide number 17, where you're showing that the trees are what has to be defensible space, which that may have been the case in Paradise, I don't know.
Says 17, yeah.
Yeah, so that side is indicating, oh, we need to have space from trees.
Yeah.
But in fact, and this was true with my husband's old house, trees didn't burn.
Yeah.
The house burned absolutely to the floor, to the ground. And on both perimeter sides of the home, the trees were still there. They were singed, but they were still standing and alive.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's really remarkable in structure fires like Palisades is that those trees are irrigated.
Mhm.
And their moisture is right underneath
Mhm.
the initial bark.
Mhm.
And so they don't burn because they're actually full of water.
Interesting.
So it's important not to malign the trees in a community.
Mhm.
We need them to keep from landslides from occurring later on.
Yeah.
Now the vegetation that regrew in Paradise, I don't know if it was native or if it was being controlled on any basis. That
Yeah.
is a concern, but I think it's important as a post-fire management researcher to be very precise about our language with regard to what does vegetation provide us with.
Yeah, I really appreciate these thoughts, and I would say that the pattern that you're describing in the Palisades fire is very similar to what happened after the campfire, in that we saw this house-to-house burning, and many of the trees were partially burned and then had to actually be removed for safety reasons afterward, which was
They
like
probably
a
didn't need
huge,
to be, but
yeah, or
they
that was
were
the claim that was
anyway.
made, they were taken down. I think the point that I maybe moved too quickly through here is that in these clusters of high loss areas, actually a lot of the like ignition behind the home to home burning was proximity to other homes, was the density. It actually, yeah, and so this is an example I just pulled from a generic CAL FIRE to illustrate, like generally we think more about single family homes when we talk about defense in that space, but I think understanding the relationship between density and likelihood of construction moves us towards actually thinking about buildings themselves as fuels and important, like potential to cause the ignition, totally separate from trees. But I really appreciate this point, and I will look for a different figure. Thank you.
What
Yeah.
was the wind speed at the time at Paradise?
I don't know the exact number, but it was also a really rapid. It was really rapid. Yeah. Yes.
I have somewhat of a related question. I was wondering, so, you're finding that mobile home parks that are densely located are more likely to burn or dense. I was wondering if you could remind me about single family versus multifamily.
Yeah. So actually, multifamily structures were the most likely to survive. And I don't know if that had to do with the landscaping around them or where they were situated on the landscape. But basically, mobile homes and RVs, by far the most likely to be destroyed, followed a bit down by single family homes, followed by multifamily homes. I would say there's relatively small number in multifamily, like not too many.
If I hear density, I
Yeah.
think about multifamily.
Yeah,
versus,
yeah.
so-
Yeah, sorry, so density here I'm referring to measured proximity to other structures. Yeah, thank you, yeah. Thank you.
I'm gonna change course to the first paper that you presented on. And the sort of, attitudes and perceptions of these folks, who moved and stayed. And first, I sort of have 1,000 questions, but I guess the one I'd focus on is kind of attribution and blame. And I guess particularly around, you said something about political ideology or partisanship, and is that about, well, California's changed and I was sticky because I lived in this community I loved and I had a home I loved, so I was sticky, and despite the fact that California was changing, so now that that's been disrupted, I'm gonna respond to this larger political context, or does it actually have to do with like the political context around blame and accountability for what they directly experienced?
Interesting. I was not, so in the set of questions that I had, it was sort of like very open. I didn't always get all the questions based on where the interview went. I had maybe a couple questions about attribution. We didn't often get there. Definitely I noticed differences in how folks would describe the causes of the fire. So this question of attribution. From more politically conservative folks, I would find that there was an emphasis on land use management by federal agencies that were to be responsible for land management. I would say though that the sort of partisan sorting findings I have, really the way people describe their desire to move was much more based on wanting to be generally in a place where they felt like broadly the laws governing that place were more aligned with their values. I would say more so than specific attributions to a higher. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
Similar on that paper, so, what was the other pull factors in terms of people determining?
Yeah.
Places where they live, like
Yeah.
family maybe, or
Mhm.
a job?
Great question. So as with like so much existing migration research, social networks were also a huge pull to different places. So one of the big questions I wanted to understand was not only like, why are you moving away and not returning, but also how are you choosing where to move to? And it was often, so like I talked to a number of older adults who relocated to where their grown adult children were living. I talked to, so actually one of the most helpful people I connected with was a realtor based in Boise who had herself grown up in Paradise, moved to Boise years before the fire, but she had these ongoing social ties with people in California. And so when the fire happened, she immediately connected with folks and helped them relocate. So some of these social ties were having friends or family places, others were just knowing another person from Paradise in that place who could support relocation. That was a huge job, I would say, yeah.
Right, so essentially it was the social ties before having a job or another financial.
So depending on the household, it would differ. What was sort of the primary pull to another place? For some people, it would be really job focused, like where could you find work? For others, really housing focused. But I would say, like broadly, social networks and the ability to find stable housing are like the two largest pulls. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So kind of two questions. One, about kind of eminent domain. You're saying that this hasn't really been done for fire before. Is there like legal hurdles that need to be overcome? And then two, you're talking about a follow-up to your study. That was like 5 years later, and it's mainly similar. Talking about what the differences.
Yeah, that's a great question. So eminent domain. I have not seen instances of, I'm not pulling up instances of eminent domain being used in the context of fire. Doesn't mean they don't exist. We're in the starting point of trying to do more active data collection on these different cases. It's an interesting legal question. I could point you towards a legal scholar named Mark Nesbitt, who's in somewhere on the East Coast. At Emory, who's been thinking and writing a lot about the legal obstacles in place. I think he approaches this question from the standpoint of we should do retreat, how do we do it? Liz and I approach this question more of like, what would retreat actually look like? What are the potential costs? What are the potential harms? Who would benefit? Who would lose? So I think we're less in the game of trying to solve policy problems, but he is someone that I would suggest that you look into. And then your second question, so the differences in the subsequent paper, the 5 years out paper, that's a great question. So this is not my paper, this is my colleague's paper. And if I'm remembering correctly, they also looked at building value and homeownership. I think those were the two trends that they saw similarities in, but I can definitely circle back and make sure I answer that question properly because I don't want to misattribute their paper. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, yes.
Thank you so much for this talk and for sharing your work. I know that me and a lot of my colleagues here at UCLA have been talking a lot about Mike Davis's great work in response to the fires that happened here, especially in Malibu. And reading through the paper entitled "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn." And I think a lot of us have really been intrigued by the idea that maybe nobody should have ever lived there to begin with, and that this process of fire is actually quite a natural process that's supposed to be happening there, and that our framing of the issue as an issue of mitigating the fire rather than allowing nature to have its natural processes is somewhat of a faulty framing itself, and then that is leading to ways of responding and reconstructing that are perhaps not relating with nature in a way that is much beneficial. Now, obviously, that's a pretty idealistic point of view, and bringing that point of view to perhaps your interviewees would maybe not be so sensitive to them or appealing. But I'm wondering if in your work you've come across any ways of thinking about this that are not just about fully retreating, which is probably ideal, but maybe very difficult as you've outlined, but that are about also thinking about working with the land in ways that allow communities to be a little bit more resilient after fires. And maybe in terms of like different building materials or different ways of relating to the land.
I love this question. It's such a good question. So Liz and I have been thinking with this essay. Liz teaches this essay, The Case for Letting Malibu Burn, for folks who are not familiar. So I think the way I approach this question is that right now we have tens of millions of people who do live in fire-prone landscapes. And so it is sort of to me, not a useful exercise to imagine, like, could we go back 200 years and imagine totally different development trajectories? Because that's just not what happens. That's not the world we live in. But I definitely agree with you that I think there are strategies for what folks working in the fire world would describe as living with fire. So when I talk to fire scientists, they're actually really supportive and like want to tell everyone about good fire and all the ways that we actually should be introducing fire on the landscape to acknowledge and recognize that, yes, we have tons of millions of people living in places where fires are a natural part of ecosystem functioning. So some of that looks like controlled burning. There's a lot of really interesting work going on indigenous cultural burning that I think moves in this direction. So I think I'm like broadly in agreement with you that like, it's not all about preventing fire at all costs, and it's certainly not about totally moving all people out of fire-prone places. I don't know if that adequately answers your question, but do we need to finish?
You do.
Yeah.